Good evening. Welcome. So glad to see all of you here tonight for this special event. My name is Gibson Fay-LeBlanc, and I'm the director of the Maine Writers Publishers Alliance. And I'm really happy to welcome you here in person tonight. Also happy to welcome the audience at home watching on their screens there. I'd like to start tonight by acknowledging that we are inhabiting the homeland of the Wabanaki people of the Dawn, who are still here living, creating, and caring for this land and water. The space we work and live in is unceded Wabanaki territory, and recognizing and naming this is one small step toward correcting narratives and practices that have denied the vitality of Wabanaki history and culture for generations. We owe a debt of gratitude to the people of the Wabanaki nations for tending to and sharing this land, and we respect and are committed to building reciprocal relationships with all Native peoples in Maine. I think the phrase, "it takes a village," is now officially a cliche, but it truly has taken many people and organizations to make this event happen tonight. I'd like to take a second to thank the Indigo Arts Alliance, Mechanics Hall, where we are in this beautiful space, the Stonecoast MFA Program at USM, for all being our partners and co-hosts. I'd like to also thank Longfellow Books, who's here tonight selling books. And thanks also to the folks at the University of Maine at Farmington, who first thought to bring Deesha Philyaw to Maine, which allowed us to ask her to extend her trip. I'd also like to just quickly add that the organizations like the ones I just mentioned help stitch together the cultural fabric of this city and this state. So please support them if you can. MWPA and Mechanics Hall are both membership organizations you can join. Indigo Arts Alliance is a fabulous arts center that you can support, including the incredible, beautiful Blackbird Children's Book Festival, which just wrapped up its second year and has a host of videos and activities to check out on their website. Please also support our public university system and our indie bookstores. Money is one form of support, but time and advocacy are others, and all are important. And one brief final plug on behalf of MWPA, and then I swear I'm going to introduce these two folks next to me. The end of September is the deadline for our fellowship named in honor of artist, writer, and storyteller Ashley Bryan. The Bryan Fellowships offer free membership, writing workshops, and other support for 5 years for Maine writers who are Black, people of color, and or members of one of the Wabanaki nations or other Native peoples. So please help us spread the word about the Bryan Fellowships and the deadline coming up at the end of September. We are so lucky to have Arisa White here tonight to be in conversation with Deesha Philyaw. Arisa is a poet, writer, and professor at Colby College. Her poetic memoir, Who's Your Daddy, is one of my favorite books of this year. It leaps from Oakland to Brooklyn to Georgetown, Guyana, in search of answers to questions about childhood and absent fathers, about identity, love, memory, and so much else. Arisa is also the co-author of Biddy Mason Speaks Up, winner of the 2020 Maine Literary Award for Young People's Literature, and several other books and chapbooks of poems. So thank you and welcome, Arisa. None other than Roxane Gay calls Deesha Philyaw's debut book of stories, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, beautifully crafted, a lovely collection. And Kiese Lemon writes, "Our new decade deserves a new literary force with major literary skills. Deesha Philyaw uses the comic, the allegorical, and the geographic to examine Black intimacies and Black secrets. Her work is as rigorous as it is pleasurable to read." And I love what Deesha herself has said about these stories, that they are filled with women who consider, and I quote, "what happens when we try to get ourselves free in large and small ways, in private or right out loud." I find the intimate joy and pain of the stories in their sentences and in the small moments of anger, desire, connection, and humor, the stuff of our day-to-day, moment-to-moment existence that they let us in on. Over the last year, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies won the PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction, the Story Prize, and the LA Times Book Prize, the Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, and it was also a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction. Please join me in welcoming Deesha Philyaw.
Thank you so much, Gibson, and thanks to all the partners and everyone who made it possible for me to be here and for just such a lovely invitation. And thank you, Arisa, for joining me. This is my first time in Maine, so, and I haven't, thank you. This has been wonderful. So I've gotten to see Farmington and Portland, and it feels like a whirlwind, but this will definitely not be my last time in Maine. And I just want to recognize two dear friends of mine. I don't know, for those of you who are writers or really in the literary world, today was the final day of announcements of the National Book Awards. And my friend Honorée Jeffers has been long listed for the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, which is her debut novel, and my friend Robert Jones for his novel, The Prophets. Please read those two books if you have not. And congratulations to all the long listers, but I had to shout out my friends. Who have created beautiful work and share their stories with us, and which is the thing that I'm lucky that I get to do, and share my stories with you, including reading tonight. I'm going to read two excerpts, and then I'll read one of the stories in full. It's the only really short one in the collection that I can read that wouldn't take up all of my time. So I'm going to start with an excerpt from a story called Snowfall. And there are 9 short stories in the collection. And to get what's happening in this little excerpt, all you really need to know is that the narrator is referring to we. And when she does that, she's referring to herself. Her name is Arlita, and her girlfriend, her partner, Rhonda. And they have moved from the south to a really cold place north, which is a lot like Pittsburgh, where I live. And I think that's about all you need to know to get into this excerpt. We were born and raised in warmer places, Georgia and Florida. Warmer, too, in the residual charm, polite smiles, and the gentility of the white people whose ancestors owned ours. In the South, the weather does not force tears from your eyes, causing the faces of passing strangers to register worry about you for a millisecond. It's the wind, you want to tell them, but a millisecond is not enough time. In the South, the weather does not hurt you down to your bones or force you to wake up a half an hour early to remedy what has been done to your steps, your sidewalk, your driveway, and your cars as you slept. But the South has hurricanes, they say. Yes, but not damn near daily, not for a full quarter of the year. You tell people up here that you're from the South, and 9 times out of 10, they say the same old thing. I'm sure you miss the sunshine. Rhonda and I both miss taking sunshine and easy morning commutes for granted. But what we really miss are the laughter and embrace of our mothers and grandmothers and aunties, kin and not kin. We miss the big oak tables in their dining rooms where, as kids in the 70s and 80s, we ate bowl after bowl of their banana pudding as they talked to each other about how much weight you'd gained like you weren't even there. We miss helping them snap green beans and shell peas, sitting at their kitchen tables, watching The Young and the Restless on the TV perched on the pass-through. We miss how they loved Victor Newman, hated Jill Foster, and envied Miss Chancellor and how she dripped diamonds and chandeliers. We miss their bare brown arms reaching to hang clothes on the line with wooden pins. We miss their sun tea, brewed all day in big jars on the picnic table in the backyard, then later loaded with sugar and sipped over plates of their fried chicken in the early evening. We miss lying next to them at night in their 4-poster beds with 2 soft mattresses covered by iron sheets and 3-generation-old blankets. We miss their housecoats, perfumed with absorbing junior liniment and hints of the white shoulders they'd spritzed on from an atomizer that morning before church. We miss tracing the soft folds in their skin when we held hands and watched our favorite television shows in their beds: Dallas, Dynasty, Knots Landing, and Falcon Crest. We miss how they laughed and were easy with each other, how their friendships lasted lifetimes, outlasting wayward husbands and ungrateful children. Outlasted that time Alma caught Joe cheating and she whacked him on the top of the head with the sword he'd brought back from the war, but he told the people at the hospital he didn't know who did it. Outlasted having to hide your medicine bottles and your shoes because otherwise 7 of your 9 children were liable to steal them. We miss how they seemed to judge everyone but themselves, or maybe that judgment was in the nerve pills they procured from the Chinese doctor on Bay Street who didn't ask questions. We miss their furtive cups of brown liquor on Friday and unabashed cries for Jesus come Sunday. We miss their one gold tooth that made us wonder who they had been as young women. We miss their blue crabs, the shells boiled to a blood red in wash tubs atop bricks over makeshift fires built in the yard. The wash tubs reminded us of cauldrons full of rock salt and cayenne-drenched water bubbling and rolling, mesh bags of seasonings and halved onions and peppers floating on top, along with potatoes and ears of corn. We miss how they stood over those cauldrons like witches stirring a potion, with sweat beading on the tips of their noses and smoke swirling around their hands and wrists. They wielded long-handled spoons to press the frantic, flailing crabs toward their deaths. We miss how they made our Easter dresses and pound cakes and a way out of no way. But we lost all those things when we chose each other. Only the memories remain, which is why, even though we grew up in different places, so many of our bedtime conversations start with, "Remember when?" As we lie there in the dark with our nostalgia and nothing to distract us from it. Not even each other, not anymore. Thank you. Something drying about wearing masks, I don't know. Next, I'm going to read a story in its entirety, and it's called Not Daniel. I parked in the shadows behind the hospice center and waited. I held a box of condoms on my lap, Magnum XLs. It was like being 16 again, except this time I bought the condoms instead of relying on the boy. This time the boy was a man I'd mistaken for someone I'd gone to junior high with when our paths first crossed 2 weeks before at the main entrance at the hospice center. I was coming, he was going. I thought he was Daniel McMurray, so I stared longer than I should have, and he stared back. Later that evening, I'd run into him again, coming out of the room across from my mother's. His mother had breast cancer, mine ovarian. I checked my phone, 10:27. I timed the Walmart run for the condoms pretty well. Not Daniel would be down in 3 minutes. To throw Nurse Irie, the night nurse, off the trail, we never left or returned to the floor at the same time. Her name wasn't really Irie, but I called her that behind her back because she was Jamaican. She was also mean as a snake. I had complained to the head of the center about her, suggesting that her brusque manner was better suited for the morgue. But Nurse Irie liked Not Daniel. She didn't cop an attitude when he asked questions about his mother's care. He told me she even joked with him late one night as he walked around the floor in skimpy running shorts. "Why, you keep walking around here in those itty-bitty things? Someone might mess around and give you a sponge bath." Nurse Irie was not a stupid woman. Perhaps she would put 2 and 2 together and figure out that Not Daniel and I were, what were we? What do you call it when your mothers are hospice neighbors and the nights are endless and sleepless, and here's someone else who spent the day talking to insurance companies and creditors and banks and pastors and relatives and friends, some more well-intentioned than others. Someone else who is the dutiful son to your dutiful daughter, another family's chief shit handler, bail bondsman, maid, chauffeur, therapist, career advisor, ATM. Here's someone else who both welcomes and dreads death as it loiters in the wings, an unpredictable actor. What do you call it when that someone else wears a wedding band but never mentions his wife by name? A wife and 2 kids back home in the next state over. Don't ask, don't tell. At exactly 10:30, Not Daniel tapped the passenger side window. For a few moments, we sat in silence the way we always did at first. Sometimes I would cry. Sometimes he would too, because we could out here, beyond the reach of our mother's Jesus, nurses on autopilot, empty platitudes and garbage theology about God's will disguised as comfort. And then eventually, one of us would speak. But this night, how to begin? Pick up where we'd left off the night before, when yet another rambling conversation about funerals and selfish siblings suddenly became kissing, became my t-shirt off, became my nipples in Not Daniel's mouth. This is how we began. Not Daniel took the box of condoms from me, removed one, and then set the box on the dashboard next to my phone. Then he set his phone on the dashboard. I knew his ringer volume, like mine, was on the highest setting because that call, could come at any moment. Then he took my face in his hands and looked at me. I dropped my eyes. No, he said, I need you to be here, all of you, here. Lifting my eyes to meet his, I felt like Sisyphus pushing that rock. In his eyes, I saw a wife, kids, dying mother. I blinked and blinked again until my vision cleared. In the back seat, Not Daniel undressed me, undressed himself, and then buried his face between my legs. I reached over my head, clutched the door behind me, and cried as I came over and over again. By the time Not Daniel put on the condom and pulled me to my knees, my legs were limp and useless. He turned me away from him, pressed his palm against the center of my back, and pushed me forward. He draped his body over mine and entered me. He was rough, but not unkind. I wondered whether he was thinking what I was thinking. What if one of our mothers dies while we're down here rutting around, as my grandmother would say? But in the cramped space of the back seat and of our grief and our need, there was no room for guilt or fear, only relief. And that's what I told Not Daniel when we were both spent, our damp backs sticking to the leather seat. Relieved? He frowned and then smiled. Relieved? Then I failed to deliver the goods. No, I said, you delivered the goods. The goods were delivered and received. But I do have a question. Shoot. Were you worried that one of them would die while we were down here? Thought never crossed my mind. Really? Really? Listen, I can either deliver the goods or I can think about my mama dying or not. I can't do both. And then I laughed, even though I felt like I shouldn't have, even though nothing was as it should be. Thank you. And I will end with the first 2 pages of a story called Peach Cobbler. Thank you. My mother's peach cobbler was so good, it made God himself cheat on his wife. When I was 5, I hovered around my mother in the kitchen watching, close enough to have memorized all the ingredients and steps by the time I was 6, but not too close to make her yell at me for being in the way, and not close enough to see the exact measurements she used. She never wrote the recipe down. Without having to be told, I learned not to ask questions about that cobbler or about God. I learned not to say anything at all about him hunching over our kitchen table every Monday, eating plate after plate of peach cobbler, and then disappearing into the bedroom I shared with my mother. I became a silent student of my mother and her cobbler-making ways. Even when I was older and no longer believed that God and Reverend Troy Neely were one and the same, I still longed to perfect the sweetness and textures of my mother's cobbler. My mother, who fed me TV dinners, baked a peach cobbler with fresh peaches every Monday, her day off from the diner where she waited tables. She always said Sunday was her Saturday and Monday was her Sunday. What I knew was that none of her days were for me. And for many of those Mondays off and on during my childhood, God, to my child's mind, would stop by and eat an entire 8x8 pan of cobbler. My mother never ate any of the cobbler herself. She said she didn't like peaches. She would shoo me out of the kitchen before God could offer me any, but I doubted he would have offered, even if I'd sat right down next to him. God was an old fat man, like a black Santa, and I imagined my mother's peach cobbler contributing to his girth. Some Mondays, God would arrive after dinner and leave as I lay curled up on the couch watching Little House on the Prairie in the living room. Other times, my mother and God would already be in the bedroom when I got home from school. I could hear moaning and pounding like a board hitting a wall as soon as I entered the house. I would shut the door quietly behind me and tiptoe down the hall to listen outside the bedroom door. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," my mother would cry. I could hear God too, his voice low and growly, saying, "Yes, yes, yes." Thank you.
Thank you for that reading. It's always so great to just hear the author just enliven the work, you know? But throughout, your prose is so beautiful, so intimate, so warm and generous. And thank you for that. I'm just curious, the book has been out for a bit, so what have the church ladies said about the book?
Well, I have an upcoming conversation with some church ladies and church gentlemen at Beulah Baptist Church in Virginia, virtually.
Oh, wow.
I got an invitation from them, and their pastor, who I think is a millennial, wrote and said, "I've got this congregation of black boomers, and they want to talk to you." They said that the book was hard to read, but that they were surprised more than anything, and they said, "We didn't know this is how the young people feel." So even though, it's 4 generations in the book, I think it was just, and it's intergenerational. And so not only am I excited because these are church folks, but they are church folks of a certain generation. And I think that some of the challenges are, generational challenges. Yeah. And so I'm excited for that conversation. And previously, I've gone to church book clubs. There's a group of black women pastors who, same thing, they reached out and said, "We want to talk to you." It always feels a little bit like being called to the principal's office. I know. But it's been wonderful. And it's what I had hoped, because I didn't want people to feel like this was some sort of middle finger to the church, but it really was, I hope it would be an opportunity for some healing conversations, and I'm hearing that that's what's happening.
That sounds amazing. And there was an interview that I read that you had with the Rumpus, and I think it was in 2020, and it's talking about fiction as your first passion, and you said something in it, and I'm just going to read it back to you. Those early attempts of writing fiction suffered because I was so stuck in my own stuff, and I wasn't really using my stuff as a springboard. And so I'm interested in how you used your stuff as a springboard, and to sort of speak of that distinction, because I feel like that distinction is what's going to enable these healing conversations, these intergenerational conversations. So especially with the pieces that you just read, I'm just curious as to which stuff served as the springboard.
I think it has to do with the fact that when I started writing fiction in general, and even some of the early stories in the collection before I knew I was writing a collection, I didn't think of this as about the church or even the characters as church ladies. I always felt like I was writing dissatisfied women. And because when I first started writing 20 years ago, that's what I was. I was, unhappy in my life, but I was not comfortable writing nonfiction about myself. And so in my nostalgia, I've been in Pittsburgh since '97, but I grew up in Florida. And, my memories and my nostalgia, all the Southern things in the book, that was my childhood. The older women, the grandmothers, that was, those were my grandmothers. And so I was remembering and sort of reaching back, and my own, what somebody introduced to me in the last year, this phrase called church hurt, where you're kind of unlearning the things from church that you learned that don't serve you. By the time I started working on these stories, I had moved beyond that myself, and it had to be two separate processes. Like, I could draw on those experiences, but writing has rarely been therapeutic for me in the sense that, my mother died in 2005, and everybody was like, oh, you should write about it. I couldn't write about my mother for a decade. Not directly like that. And so sometimes it bubbles up to the surface subconsciously. So I think what was helpful is that I didn't look to the writing and the stories for my healing, because I tend to have this long arc, I guess. But it was the nostalgia, and it was, well, this is what I'm missing, and sort of remembering those things. But what's in the collection that bubbled up kind of organically without me being intentional was mother-daughter stuff. And so it's like my stuff can still be there, if I'm not thinking too much about it. But my next collection of stories, I'm going to be intentional about the mother-daughter stuff. I really want to explore those things intentionally now. So I think that's it, that I had to let the work be the work and not let the work be my therapy. Not to say that writing can't be therapeutic for other people. It just hasn't been for me. And I also was thinking early in my writing that I couldn't write about certain things. And that was also tied up with my ideas around religion and Christianity, that you couldn't write about sex as explicitly. And so I was also standing in my own way with that. I had to let go of that.
Which leads me to my next question, because I'm curious about which tropes and which stereotypes of the Southern Black lady of the Southern Black church that you were attempting to subvert.
I think it was less about subversion intentionally and more about centering. And so who gets centered? Whose point of view do we normally get? And so what happens when we let people, it shouldn't be radical, like people telling their own story, but for Black women, that's not always the case, And so I think I was thinking more in terms of, if I made someone the center that normally is on the margins, what would they say, or what would they say what do people say or do when they don't think anyone else is watching? So you get a story like Eula, that's a big secret. So I was thinking of that more so than the tropes. I think something else, I'm thinking of the story Jael, where the main character is a 14-year-old girl. Some of these stories are writing characters who are bolder than I am. I wanted to just write characters who were bold in some way, and some of it are a little revenge tale. So, like a lot of Black girls, unfortunately, Jael experiences street harassment and in her own community, and she and her best friend are the target of a neighborhood predator, and that's such an unfortunately uncommon story, and Jael fights back.
I love that.
Because it's not always safe to fight back.
True.
So it was more that, I think, is like kind of a what if, I had done these things when I was a child, or what if, there's another story, Dear Sister, where it's a letter. It's an epistolary story, and these 4 half-sisters are writing to a 5th half-sister that they found out about, and that happened in my life. I have 4 half-sisters, and after our father died, the four of us called her, which is a horrible thing to do to someone. That's very overwhelming. And
Wait, all four of you were on the phone?
all four of us on the phone. We had her on speaker. This poor woman, the fact that she even speaks to us now is amazing. And so I was not interested in violating my sister's privacy, so none of my sisters are in this book. But I got to explore, what if we did that right?
Yeah.
And also, I didn't have relationships with my sisters the way that I wish we had, so I gave those relationships to those characters those are messy and they don't all get along, but they really love each other. And I think that if there's anything subverted there, they are the children of what we would call a deadbeat father, but that's sort of beside the point. They're not tragic.
And that's what's like wonderful about Dear Sister and Jael, all of the characters in the book, is that in this way, the secret life is very much creating a third space that feels safe and free from God. So like God operates as this invisible character that's sort of pressurizing everyone's life and, sort of set up these kinds of norms you need to perform. But you open up this door, this secret life door, that allows us into this kind of intimacy, into kind of the messy parts of being human, like revenge, anger, sex, queer love, all of the fun, great stuff that makes us complicated. And noticing, too, it was like all of the stories are, for the most part, in first-person narration. And I was like, of course, you couldn't have done this in an omniscient voice, because that's the all-knowing voice. That's already God operating in their lives. And so to center the Black women, the church ladies with their secrets, is to make their own world for them. And so one of the things I loved is this voice, these very self-possessed first-person voices, and also the ways in which you use different structures to bring those voices out. So you mentioned the epistolary form with Dear Sister, and why that particular form? Because it's not just a letter to someone. You are doing some amazing craft work in it. Like, you are flashbacking, you have grandma's voice, you have the sister voices in it. It is a very dense, dynamic kind of letter. So just kind of talk about why the letter form.
As I mentioned earlier, it was like a do-over from that phone call, so I thought it would be, fun and interesting to do it as a letter, which is what it should have been, in the first place. And I will say that when because my book was published on a university press, there was the peer review process. There's Reader 1 and Reader 2. Okay. And Reader 1 really pushed back on the epistolary form, and later I found out who Reader 1 was, and I felt like I may have insulted, because I came back, because you get to respond to your readers, and they were saying no one would say all of this in a letter. And so it's like that Kermit the Frog meme where he's typing like this. I was researching and like finding out how old is this form, and I'm, documenting how far, and I was like, is this person not familiar? Like, epistolary form isn't always strictly the way you would write in a letter. I mean, there are some liberties that you take, but you have to be really careful. And I was teaching a workshop on this summer, and I was saying, the tricky thing is, if you're writing to someone you can't tell them things they already know, but then your reader needs to know certain things. You have to be really artful in getting that in there. But I had a lot of leeway, because my the letter writer was writing to someone she didn't know, so she could say a lot more things, because she was essentially writing to a stranger. But I knew I was taking liberties by putting in dialogue and all of those things. And I just thought, and I love working with editors, and I'm not precious about my writing, but I went to the mat for that, and I thought, it works.
Yeah.
And the other reader didn't have a problem with it. That was my final line, which was, I think this is just a matter of personal taste. But it packs a lot.
It really does.
And I thought, I'm going to push the bounds of that a little bit.
And I love that you did, because it's so, I feel like it's so Black. Like it feels like at the like coffee table, dining room table playing spades. And how do you capture the multivocal quality of family? And it's not a single voice. It's like reporting back, and it's like letting you know what's going on and what so-and-so is wearing. And I think that it's, you know, this wonderful way of introducing this sister into the family.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
Yeah, and I also love the form, and like there's the few forms. So the kind of instructional, like the instruction manual, the instruction for married Christian husbands.
Which is redundant, and I was like, why? Only after the book came out, I was like, it should be married Christian men, but there is something about that. It's like emphasizing the married part, I guess. I don't know.
It goes with the kind of instruction, sort of like directive too, right? This is a very particular kind of like man we're dealing with, a married man, a husband, a Christian. So why the manual for this particular voice and character?
So, one, you know, I just love playing with form, and I also get bored easily, and so sometimes it's like, well, I'll try and do it this way. What if, you know, I'm kind of experimenting. I like to experiment. And one thing I tell a lot of young writers and emerging writers is that, you know, if you're lucky, writing can feel like play. And so, you know, one way to play with writing is through form. But that story in particular, it's the next to last story in the collection, but it's actually the last one I wrote.
Oh, okay.
And I had written, you know, 15 or 20 pages of a traditional narrative about a woman who has these serial affairs, and then there's this one particular man, and I had written, you know, how they met and all of this stuff. And so when I had done that months before, and then it was, you know, deadline is looming, and I got one more story I got to put in this collection. So I pulled it out, those pages, and I was bored, you know, and one thing I always think is, if I'm bored, the reader's going to be bored. If I don't laugh, the reader's not going to laugh. And I just thought, I don't have anything fresh to say about this. You know, what? I mean, somebody's going to fall in love, they're going to get caught, you know, snore, like it was nothing. And then I was talking to a friend, and, you know, we often send each other things from social media, you know, what's funny today, what's the news of the day. And that particular day, there was some shirt that had kind of gone viral, and this, it was a woman who made a line of t-shirts that said, "I heart her husband." And I just thought, what an awful thing, like who would do that? And then the next day there was like a response t-shirt. It was like, "But I have his 401k," or, you know, like, but what struck me, you know, once the laughter dies down, there's something there. Where's the guy who's, you know, in the heart of all of this? And why are women sort of fighting with each other? And whose story is this? And who's controlling the narrative? And we actually call the mistress, you know, in popular culture, the side chick. Like, literally, she's in the margins. So I thought, what if instead of this woman being in the margins, as I was trying to do with the other characters, what if she was at the center? What if she got to control the narrative? What if she got to control the relationship? What if she got to make the rules? And what if it was a literal rule book, like an instruction manual? Great. And but of the pages that I wrote, there were two pieces I really liked, which is the introduction, which is sort of, she talks about the men that she prefers, the infantilized husband of godly women, or something like that, accomplished godly women. And then there was another section that I liked, which was, that felt like ritual to me, of undressing, of the ways that the men undress and removing the wedding ring. And I could see those pieces being a part of this instruction manual, and then I built the rest of it around.
That's amazing. I love that. And also, I was also reminded of For Colored Girls. Like, I forget which color girl that was, who was like, "I love the men, but they all have to leave, and I take a bath." Like this really ritualistic way of claiming what could be disempowering, but because you make a series of instructions, you can cleanse yourself almost. It's almost like this woman becomes her own god in a way, which I loved. And I would say, like, even one of the hard parts about reading the book is, like, when you open it and you start out on this journey, you're like, where are these women disempowered? Where would they get, like, how will they get their power back? And just like waiting for that, only to recognize come the end of the book that, you know, it's like they are God. They make their lives. They are making choices. Regardless of what we think about those choices, they are creating their lives. And so I love the character Jael. And in that particular story, you are referencing a Bible story. Can you talk about that story and how you were working with that, with this particular character and piece?
So I read the story of Jael, which is in the book of Judges, and it's the song of Deborah, and she's singing of Jael. And I don't remember where I first read it, but it was not in the Bible. It was being referenced in something, and then I immediately went to the Bible and looked it up because it's such a violent story. And the Bible is violent, but what struck me was that I couldn't think of another instance in the Bible of a woman being violent. I'm not aware. And not only was it violence, but it was so personal. And so if you know, police or detectives, they'll tell you if you shoot someone, that's one thing. If you stab someone, that's extra personal. So Jael nails this man's head to the floor, and I can't think of anything more personal than that.
I know.
And so I said, I don't know what I'm gonna do with this, but I'm gonna save it. Like, I save things, and sometimes I come back a week later, sometimes it's 2 years, and so I had saved that, and again, when I was building this collection, I thought, what can I do with this? And I had this idea of a girl, a 14-year-old black girl who had that name. Why would somebody name a child that? Who would do that? And what were the circumstances? And then what were the implications? What could it be? So I started with that idea, and I didn't know at first that there would be a murder committed, but I like the idea that her great-grandmother who's raising her sees her, because her grandmother is very traditional evangelical Christian, and so sees her as, the devil has her kind of thing. And then I paid a little homage to this movie called The Bad Seed, which is one of my mother's favorite movies. That and Imitation of Life. We used to watch those movies every time they came on television. And in The Bad Seed, there's this little girl named Rhoda who goes around killing people too. And the way they explained it was that it was just like born in her, and it skips a generation. So that's how I, built that idea that the grandmother had, that Jael was just like her grandmother who had, whose best friend died under suspicious circumstances. And so I just wanted to play with those elements to see what would happen. And I had never really written violence before. And then the scene when she ultimately kills someone, like, it just happened. Like, I hadn't plotted that out. I rarely outline anyway. And I think I surprised myself. And you would have thought I had killed somebody after I wrote it, because it just felt a little overwhelming. But yeah, it started with her name.
Yeah, and it's also a wonderful dialogue of voices too. Like, you have the great-grandmother and Jael, and this very kind of dramatic sort of setup of these voices going back and forth between each other. And I think that's just this wonderful tension. And even that scene of the killing was so smooth. It was like a smooth criminal kind of movement.
Yay!
But what was so heartbreaking was when, the daydream that Jael has with Sadie, of speaking to Sadie about drowning in her, believing that she was drowning in her own tears. I started crying at that. I was like, that's just brilliant and beautiful.
Thank you.
And that level of tenderness to get there was just like, yes, I was ready for it, and I needed Jael to actually have that release too.
She desperately needed
She's
tenderness.
Yes.
But her grandmother was so busy trying to fix her and trying to, and that's what I wanted to show as well, that her grandmother had wonderful intentions in her own mind, but she was missing what this child so desperately needed. And I think that happens to a lot of us, that we don't get the tenderness that we need. And shortly after the 2016 election, I edited and published with my friend Vanessa German a collection of writing and art by Black women called Tender.
Nice.
Because we were thinking, like, in that post-election world, like, goodness, Black women need some tenderness, you know?
Indeed.
And so Jael needed that so desperately.
And the story, speaking of tenderness, how do you make love to a physicist? Oh my God, I love that one so much. I'm just like, I love it.
Thank you.
But yes, it was this, that piece. One, I was starting to think about God as this sort of gravitational pull, right? The invisible character, everyone is sort of in the physics of religion. Mm-hmm. And then we get to this moment of like how to make love to a physicist, where the main character now gets to have her own a new gravitational pull. And then you have this anaphora going in, right? The repetition of, of how do I make love to a physicist? She's in therapy, and that structuring it with this kind of question, the sort of what if, the kind of scientific method is embedded in that, the therapeutic method is embedded in that. And that question seems to like break her out of the confines of what her mother taught her, what religion has taught her. So tell me about this story and the physicist and, making love to him.
One of my favorite parts of that story, there's a part where the main character, Lyra, is talking to Eric, who is a physicist, and she had assumed that he was an atheist. And some of the questions she had about science and religion were questions that, I've had as well. And she starts to think about, he has this very expansive understanding of God, a God, which is different than the God she's taught, which seems to be a bit smaller. And it dawns on her, because her mother is always delighting in, those who, or, only those who follow the narrow way will see the face of God. And she observes that if suddenly Christianity and heaven welcomed everyone, her mother, if God welcomed everyone into heaven, her mother would abandon Christianity immediately. And that, that kind of revelation was really important to her. But for me, the story came about because I met a physicist and developed this huge crush on him.
Oh, yay.
And was like, yes, this is, I claimed him. And it was not reciprocal, though. But I did get my first introduction to the story, and I wrote that and, again, saved it. I write things and I leave it and I come back. And but the question, how do you make love to a physicist, it gave me a little framework, which is who is asking this question, who's the physicist, and then I think that I also wrote, how do you make love to a physicist? It happens on Pi Day. So I got these two people. It's going to be March 14th. I got to fill in the middle.
It's so.
And I've got to complicate things for them. And it was a big question for me. What happens after Pi Day? Do they get to be happy? And I felt like God, like myself, like, yes, they will be happy. I will allow them to be happy.
But the character is also like, well, maybe not, and ghosting and doing
Didn't
all
she
of.
Get on your nerves?
Yeah, she's so bad on my nerves. I'm like, Eric is a hottie. Like, he's laying down the quantum physics love stuff for you. I know. So I just, kind of my last question for you is congratulations on the HBO Max.
Thank you.
Which seems like the most desired outcome for a published book, for it to be like adapted into film or TV. And so, like, how did that happen for you? And how is the adaptation process going?
I'll answer the last part first. Very, very, very slowly.
Okay.
Everything moves slowly until it doesn't, and then it's like, hurry, hurry, hurry. But it really is a dream for a writer in the sense that, some writers, this is what they really want, and other writers, it's just, we're always trying to figure out how to keep writing but also keep eating. And so, it's a great outcome. Sometimes when there's interest in a writer's work from Hollywood, probably most of the time, they want to option the rights to your work, and then they want you to kind of go, just take a check and go away and let them hire a screenwriter and all of that. And that's what often happens, and you get an offer and you can take it or leave it. What was really wonderful for me is that the first person who approached me is a showrunner for a major network, and she's someone I'd known for a while. And she said, you know, I would want you to write this, and I would want you to be an executive producer. And she has, you know, is making her mark in Hollywood, and like my friend Kiese Lehman does in the publishing industry, is bringing as many people with her as she possibly can. So she was like, everything in this industry is about power. And she said, I want to do this, but I want you to be empowered in the process if you're interested in writing it. And I was like, I am absolutely interested in writing it, you know, and revisiting these characters and putting them, using this different medium. And so that was my first offer. So then when other offers came in, they had to match that offer or just go away.
That's amazing.
And it was like, they, you know, they're interested in the rights, and it was like, she wants to write, sure, she can write. And that's different from someone saying, we really want you to write. So there were probably about 4 or 5 offers on the table with, you know, great companies, and, you know, I'm ultimately working with Tessa Thompson, but, you know, there were other big name folks that I was sitting on the Zoom with like this, like, I can't believe I'm on a Zoom with this person. So we got a number of offers, and then the night that we were preparing the counter offers, because you go back and forth, HBO Max swoops in and says, hey, we want to make an offer, and we've got somebody attached, but we can't tell you who it is. Can you give us 1 day? And we're like, oh, okay. You know, and then meanwhile, I've been waiting to do the counteroffer thing, and they said, it's worth the wait. So we said, okay, fine, we'll delay the process. And so when they make an offer, there's all the business side, but then there's what they call a creative call, which is on Zoom. So I had the Zoom with Tessa Thompson and the HBO Max team, because she had just signed her deal with them for her production company. And it was the best conversation. I had really good conversations with others, but it was something about, you know, we saw eye to eye on a lot of the things that we love about the stories and wanted to preserve in the television adaptation. But she asked me a question that nobody else did. She said, what are you afraid of in this process? What are you worried that might happen that you don't want to happen? And that's when I knew I want to work with her. And she's Tessa Thompson.
Yes.
So.
That's amazing. Yay.
Thank you.
I would really like to let these two just keep talking all night. It feels like we could do that, but
I know, I had to stop myself.
I am aware of time, and I also do want to open it up in case there are questions in the audience. So, and I would, how this will work is I'll just ask you to keep your masks on, and I'll bring the mic over to you, and I'll hang on to the mic, but hold it out for you. So, looks like we've got a question right here.
First of all, thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Also, how did you get away with not including any white people in the story?
That's easy.
You know, from the publishing company, because they would want to increase distribution.
That is a wonderful question, and sometimes people don't like when I say this, but so much of this business is luck, right? Because I was terrified that people were going to ask me, I didn't think so much they were going to say put in a white character, but I thought that they were going to say this book doesn't have a broad appeal. All of the coded language for, you know, you've got to think about the white gaze, and I was not thinking about the white gaze at all. And I had actually heard horror stories from other writers who found themselves being pressured in that way. And I made up my mind that I would walk away if somebody tried to pressure me, and I would just self-publish the book. And I don't know what happened, but at West Virginia University Press, my editor was a dream to work with. And she saw me as the expert on Black culture. She's a white woman. And so she would ask me questions to clarify things. She never asked me to translate Black culture for white people or anything like that. And so I was just really fortunate to work with an editor and with a press that really believed that these stories could appeal to lots of people, including white people, even though there aren't white people in the book. And they, and we were right, And I hope that, and I talk about this every chance I get, so I hope other publishing companies are listening, but more importantly, I hope other Black writers and other writers of color are listening to know that you can push back against that, and maybe that's not the place for your work if somebody tries to pressure you that way.
Other questions? No, I'm
okay, got it. It's so interesting to hear you talk about how you've written scraps of things and then put them down and returned to them a couple years later. And I'm just curious about the process of putting together this whole collection, like in terms of how many years did it take, or what was the first story? You talked a little bit about the last one, but just how did this all come together from those pieces?
So I was supposed to be writing a novel. It still hasn't gotten written. And I was just detouring away from that novel. And with my ex-husband, I wrote a co-parenting book, and that's how I got an agent. And so she knew I was working on a novel. And so she said, when you have that novel ready, I'll be, ready to send it out and find a home for it. And I was also writing short stories, and I kept stalling on the novel, and she saw a connection between the short stories, and she called them church lady stories, because as I said, I wasn't thinking of them that way. And she said, well, while you're on hiatus from this novel, which is a nice way to put it, maybe you could get intentional about building a collection of short stories. And so the earliest stories were Eula, Not Daniel, and Peach Cobbler. And so I had written those before I knew I was building a collection. And then I got really intentional, and I started reaching back to those pieces. And so I would say that, I don't know how old those scraps were, but it was about a 5 or 6 year process of, pulling it all together.
Any other questions? Oh, here we go.
So did you intentionally think about linking the stories together? I'm curious about that because a lot of authors talk about linked short stories versus a novel in stories. So could you talk a little bit about the difference in your process?
Yeah, I thought that I would link the stories, and I thought a way to do it would be that there would be some connection to each of the stories. They would all be connected in some way to a single church through time, because it covers many years. And I found myself trying to force that into a story, and I was like, anything I have to force doesn't belong here. And so I abandoned that idea. There are only 2 stories in the collection that are linked, and that happened incidentally. So the main character in Peach Cobbler, Olivia, she is the narrator in Instructions for Married Christian Husbands, and I hadn't planned that, but I think that I couldn't let go of Olivia. She just stayed with me. And when I started writing the part in Instructions where the narrator is talking about herself, and she says, I own a bakery and I make the best peach cobbler in town, I went, oh my gosh, it's Olivia. And I was like, we're going to go with that. I don't know. She decided to pop up, so I'll let her stay.
We might have time for one more. There's one more. We could also end there. I think I want to say a huge thank you to Deesha Philyaw and Arisa White for this conversation. Thanks to all of you for being here. Deesha is going to sign some books we have in the back from Longfellow Books if you'd like to grab a signed copy. I'd also like to say to our audience at home, you should order a signed copy from Longfellow Books, and we can arrange to get it to you. So thanks everybody for being here tonight.